Hello there, I'm Sconchulus, and this is a tier list for the current June 2021 TEPPEN format. We're a month and a half into rotation as well as Ace vs. the People, and the meta has started to somewhat define itself. I thought now would be the perfect time to have some fun and make a tier list. Of course, I don't claim to be an all-knowing expert on the meta, which is why I've done a bit of research and will link my sources in the description below. First of all, we do have tournament results. Durian did a great video on the recent WCS where he goes over top 32 into top 4. This gives us great insight into what the top players think is good as well as what is winning at those top levels. My next source is the direct opinion of top players. TTA, the True Asian, posted his top 10 decks to the TEPPEN subreddit 2 weeks ago, and I will link that in the description as well. My third source is the in-game hero leaderboards. These show the current top 100 for each hero and the wins it took them to get to top 100. This is somewhat of a popularity list, but also shows us what decks people want to play as well as what heroes are getting them the wins. With all that said, let's move right into the tier list with the current best deck, Zero Slow Purple. The Otani agility interaction alone makes this deck a meta-defining threat, but now that everybody knows it's the best deck, it is getting somewhat teched against. The deck is still able to beat any of its matchups in the right hands, but it is no longer unbeatable. Moving on to Zero's next hero art, we have Tenkuha. This hero art has seen a bit of experimentation thanks to the buffs to God's Gift Waka, but I don't think there's quite enough there to have fully brought a strategy together. You can potentially catch people off guard with some boat shenanigans, but I think the potential to catch people off guard places the deck in rogue tier. Zero's last hero art, Rakuha, is a shell of its former self, but that is mostly because the payoffs for a full action purple deck are no longer there the way they once were. Moving on to Morrigan, I think some of you might be surprised to hear that Morrigan Temptation is comfortably tier 2. The winner of the recent WCS was playing Temptation. They were also playing slow, but the power of Temptation should not be understated. Next we have Shadowblade, which simply does not cut it as a generic hero art and doesn't really have a niche outside of being a generic hero art. What I think will surprise some of you even more than these two placements is that Darkness Illusion is also a completely viable strategy. This deck made it all the way to top 8 in the recent WCS, and has had a respectable power level ever since the tools it received from Ace vs. the People. Moving on to Dante's first hero art is another art that I do not see a niche for. This deck also pales as a generic hero art behind Temptation and Fade, and doesn't happen to enable any deck in particular. Unlike Dante's next hero art, Ebony and Ivory, which I believe to be a solid rogue option. This deck has crazy high roll with big resonate and will take a lot more games than people give it credit for. As for what I believe to be Dante's strongest hero art, Devil Trigger does enable his classic Bernte playstyle as well as some aggro, but neither of these strategies are quite at the top of the tier list this season. He is comfortably a rogue pick. Moving on, we have Ada Wong, who I believe to be the sleeper hit of this season. Blackout is a perfectly acceptable generic hero art that we will place just above Devil Trigger. The real standout for Ada this season is Mirage Decoy, which is a strong anti-meta choice against slow purple and Bringer of Nightmares. For this reason, I am going to place Mirage Decoy in tier 2, just above Darkness Illusion. Ada's last hero art, Breakaway, has a number of extremely cool interactions and combos, but doesn't quite have the same anti-meta edge as Mirage. I think the deck is a solid rogue choice and will catch people off guard every time. With all of the purple heroes ranked, we will move our way onto green, starting with Chun-Li. Kiko Show is an extremely powerful hero art for any deck that wants to win on board. Kiko Machines had a great deal of success earlier in the season, as well as a bit of success with Kiko Humans. Those two decks are the reason I am going to place Kikosho just above Mirage Decoy. Next we have Chun's Lightning Kicks, and for this I pose a thought experiment. When you think of Chun Lightning Kicks, what deck comes to mind? Maybe that's a bit unfair, but there is really no deck for lightning kicks. The art is solid and you can play it in a number of decks, but it's nothing meta-defining. Last for Chun, we have the ever-meta Yawn. This deck does crazy things in the hands of top players, but how does it stack up this season? I think Yawn has fallen off somewhat in the face of certain new decks, but it is still comfortably Chun's best hero art and can do just about anything you want it to. Moving on to the most popular underpowered green hero is X. Heart Tank is a fine choice for green and has a couple of great interactions, but there's nothing that really pushes it over to meta. We are going to place this right next to Tenkuha. Charge Shot, on the other hand, a lot of people write this deck off, but if you have ever seen it in the hands of a top player, you know why this deck is tier 2. This deck did make top 8 in the WCS. It's just not a deck that's easy to play unless you are really good. X's last hero art unfortunately feels like you are playing no hero art at all when you activate it. I think Gyre Armor is in need of a bit of a rework to stay competitive with the meta. Next we have the hero art that Heart Tank wishes it could be, Feline Shieldspire. There's a number of ways you can play this hero art this season. Green-Purple Evidence was an early hit, but classic Shieldspire legendaries is the reason I am going to place this hero art in tier 2 just behind Kiko Shell. Feline's next hero art, Choral Orchestra, got a lot of early hype for Spirits with Mia Fey, but the deck is somewhat lacking in closing power and really just has low power threats to overpower you. The deck is good, but any great deck will beat it. That is why we are going to place Feline Choral Orchestra just ahead of Lightning Kicks. Feline's last hero art, Plunderblade, doesn't really do a whole lot. I've only ever really seen it used to mill the other player, and at that point you might as well be playing any other hero art. This hero art is definitely in need of a rework, but I have a feeling that's something nobody wants to see. Moving on to the last green hero, we have Nero. Devil Breaker is a classic aggro art, but hasn't exactly found a good shell this season. I'm going to place it just behind Heart Tank. Moving on to True Power, I'm gonna go out on a limb and say I think this is the current best green deck. With Black Destroy at an all-time low, True Power can set up Unconcerned, and this deck can high roll the heck out of you. In the hands of the top players, this deck is really doing things this format, and I think it just edges out Yawn. Moving on to Hey Nico, I think this is a great hero art, but it's basically the definition of rogue. You'll catch your opponent off guard with it because they'll never know what you're bringing, but there's no strategy in particular that it pushes into tiered status. With all of our green heroes out of the way, we will move on to the most popular color, red. The numbers do not lie. Starting off with Ryu, I think Hadoken is a perfect shell for any of the number of powerful red decks this format. This art is right at home in red humans and a number of other strategies, which is why I am going to place it as our second deck in tier 1. Next on the tier list we have Met's Shoryuken, and this deck has nothing but good matchups this season. This deck is great against slow as well as black, and green, which would normally seal your combo units, is at an all-time low. That's why I am going to place Met's Shoryuken at the top of tier 2. As for Ryu's most infamous hero art of all, this is an easy tier 1 placement. When this deck does its thing the way it wants to, it does feel unbeatable, and in the hands of the best players, it will always feel unbeatable. There are some ways to play around denjin, but when you're gonna lose to burn, it's coming a mile away. Moving on to Jill, we have Antibody Activation, which lost a lot of its juice to rotation. Without Hellbat and Detonation, the deck doesn't quite have the legs it once had, but there are still enough good Explorer units like, I don't know, Strider, that this deck remains perfectly rogue playable. Jill's next hero art, Genesis, has completely vanished from the game. I haven't seen a single boat player since Detonate left the format. That's why I am placing Genesis at the very bottom of the tier list. Jill's last hero art, Ultimate Weapon, is basically another shell for denjin, and I'm not exactly knowledgeable enough to know the pros and cons of either, so I am simply going to place it in tier 2. Our next red hero, Amaterasu GDI, is easily the best shell for red humans. This is the deck with the best punish in the game right now, and is easily a tier 1 choice. Thunder Edge did see a bit of a renaissance with Steel Samurai, but it's not really enough to push the deck onto a tiered status. CEM is in a similar boat, but the strong interactions this deck does have, like 5 MP Rathalos and Amaterasu, is enough that I will place it above Thunder Edge. Moving on to what most would consider the least viable of the 4 red heroes, Rathalos, and that is nowhere more true than in Dive Attack. This hero art is completely outshone by CEM, and for that reason I will place it just behind Lightning Kicks. Blazing Wall is at least more unique, giving shield to a color that would not otherwise have it, but for some reason I usually only see this in red-green lists, which already have shield. I'm not entirely sure what is up with Blazing Wall, and for that reason I will place it just above Lightning Kicks. The last Rathalos hero art is an entirely different story. Rathalos has become one of the most fearsome decks at the top levels of play, but I do think it takes a bit of skill to play at that level. If you look at the hero leaderboard for Rathalos, the current top Wrath player has a huge amount of wins, but below them the numbers are much more in line with other weaker heroes. This is probably somewhat because there's only one good Rathalos deck, but potentially also because that deck is somewhat hard. Even despite that, I think the deck is easily tier 1. This deck steals games like no other, and if you can't stabilize in the early game, this deck will win off that alone. With all those placed, we are now on to our last color, black. First of all, Nergigante. Had to get to it sooner or later, but this hero is not that great this season. Looking at the top 100 for Nergigante, the top players are doing fine, but to become a top 100 Nergigante at the time of recording takes only 16 wins. That's not to diminish the accomplishment of the players who have gotten top 100 with Nerg. I think that is just as difficult as getting top 100 with Zero this format. Nerg is just quite literally 5 times worse than Zero. Spike Dive Bomb I think is Nerg's most viable hero art. I'll place it just above Dive Attack, but it's a bit slow and very risky. Spike Dive Bomb I do believe has a perfectly playable core in the form of Badger Bomb, but that deck is hit by the 3-drop hate people are playing for the current best decks. Even without that, I think the deck is at best rogue, and I will place it just behind Spike Launch. Nerg's last hero art is strong in theory, but is held back entirely by an unnecessary restriction. If this hero art were reworked, it could be playable, but in its current form, there are better options. Next, we have the meta-defining queen of TEPPEN, Oichi. Despair is just as strong this format as it was last season, now packing all the tech it needs to beat slow, letting it stay in control and steal every game with Curse. Oichi is an easy tier 1 placement. Oichi's other hero arts are not quite on the same level, particularly Dancing Dead, which I think is no different than Shadowblade. It has no niche and fails as a generic hero art. Dark Invitation, on the other hand, does have a deck to call its own in the form of Spider Blight, but that deck is still only rogue at best. I'm going to place Dark Invitation right below Spike Launch. Nearing the end of our tier list, we move on to Akuma, Raging Demon, and while this deck has gotten no weaker this season, I feel like people aren't playing it, and the top 100 Akuma leaderboard backs that up. He's not exactly struggling, but for an art that has a great slow purple matchup, I would have expected more from Akuma. I'm still going to place him in tier 2, but I don't think Akuma has the presence we would expect from him this season. Ashura Senku is in a similar boat. The deck still has access to all of its strongest tools, but I feel like everybody knows how to beat this deck at this point. The The best decks in the format will be able to beat you before you get to your combo, and if the combo doesn't win you the game, the deck doesn't have another way to stabilize. I still think the deck is very strong, and is a solid tier 2 choice. Akuma's last hero art, Sekia, is better than you think it is. It's completely playable in spirits or other decks, but doesn't really have anything that brings it to its full potential. I think the deck is a fine rogue option and will place it just above dive attack. Last of all, but far from least, we have Wesker. His first hero art, Ouroboros, definitely fell off somewhat this format, going from his strongest to his weakest. This deck does still have plays in the form of the Franziska Crackdown deck or the Nemesis deck, but I think those are far more beatable than Uro has ever been, and for that reason I will place it just behind Heart Tank. Wesker's last hero art, Dark Destruction, was already doing fine last season, and only gets better in a more defined meta. For that reason, I am going to place Dark Destruction just above Raging Demon. And that brings us to our very last hero art, Bringer of Nightmares. This hero art has been the real shakeup this season, and is a big part of why I do not think Green is performing as well. Green is completely outdone in stats by Bringer of Nightmare, and the deck has solid matchups against all the other tier 1 decks. For that reason, I am going to place Bringer of Nightmares just behind Oichi Despair in tier 1. I think the deck has the potential to be better than Despair, but is unexplored at the moment and is also hit by all of the same tech people are playing for slow. Going back over the list, I feel pretty good about tier 1. Hadoken might be a bit of an overrate. I guess I can move that down to about where Yawn is. Slurple is undoubtedly the best deck, followed by Despair and Bringer of Nightmares. GDI and Denjin remain serious tier 1 threats, and Wrath Awokens is the big breakout threat of the meta. Alright, after moving things around a little bit, I feel pretty good about this as my final tier list. If you disagree with any of my placements, feel free to let me know down below, or make your own tier list using the link in the description. As for the next video, we will be back to your regular scheduled TEPPEN deck profiles. I just wanted to try something a little different to get back in the weekly groove. Please let me know what you thought of this discussion type of video, and whether you would want to see more tier lists or other meta discussion in the future. Please like the video if you liked the video, subscribe if you subscribed. Once again, I'm Sconchulus, and I will see you in the next one.